Welcome to the Love Deep Lab podcast, helping you integrate sex, sexiness, sacredness, and science in your life and your bedroom. And now, your host, Dr. Stormy.
Hi, I'm your host, Dr. Stormy. Thanks for tuning in today. Today, we are going to talk all about trauma. And you might be thinking, oh, trauma. I've got enough of that in life or in the world collectively. Why do I want to listen or watch something about trauma? But today, I have an amazing guest with us, and we're going to talk about trauma as a universal experience, ways to sort of normalize and shed light and love on trauma, and also ways to integrate and heal your trauma so that it could be something that you don't have like on a skeleton in your closet, but really a part of your healing and your growth. And it is such a collective experience. So this episode really is for all of you out there listening. So I'm so excited to have you join us. And I want to introduce our amazing guest, Kaleo Awana. She is a licensed therapist and ICF certified executive coach who specializes in helping high-level professionals work through all the heavy junk, keeping them stuck, stressed, and sick so they can heal, break negative patterns, and powerfully up-level every area of their life. She's the founder and CEO of The Growth Establishment and runs her international practice from beautiful Salt Lake City, Utah. And I have the pleasure of having worked with Kaleo professionally, and it's super awesome to have her here. Welcome, Kaleo.
Oh, thank you so much, Stormy.
Happy to have you and share time. So this is your passion. This is your jam. When we were talking about things to talk about, this is what you felt most lit up about sharing with people. And we can just start there. Like, what for you, why working with trauma? Why did you choose of all the things to be so amazingly badass and excited about working with and helping people with trauma?
Yeah, so when I first got into this field, I guess I would never call myself like a diagnostic clinician. Certainly the DSM, I think, has its value and benefit and can really help people understand kind of their inner and outer workings. But I always just sensed that there was something else to it. And, the further I've gone along in my career, I really believe that at the core, of all of our shit is usually unresolved and unmetabolized trauma. And I really love to see that. I believe psychology is picking up on this and moving in that direction as well. Understanding that I don't really think we serve each other well or serve our clients well when we just look at things like, a diagnosis or medication, behavior change on the surface. Not to say that those things are bad, but without really addressing, again, what's at the root of our depression or our anxiety. What is at the root of, our really labile mood or our lack of confidence? And that's where trauma work, I think, really addresses those core root issues. And I just see people's entire lives shift and change when they do this kind of work. And I also was really inspired as I did my own trauma work. I have been a therapist for about 20 years, and I entered therapy about 20 years ago as well. And I just remember the dramatic changes in my life that started to happen as I addressed kind of all of the unmetabolized trauma that I had, the ways that my life opened up, the way I came to know myself, the way I started feeling and functioning better. And so I was just hooked, I think, from immediately trying some, deep trauma work myself with someone that I just really connected with and felt so safe with. And it's an ongoing journey, right? Dealing with our trauma is really more of a marathon. It's not a sprint, but there are so many beautiful gifts along the way.
I love that. I love what you said about unmetabolized trauma. Like, so maybe you could share a little bit with our listeners. Like, you and I are both total brain geeks as far as how trauma lodges in our body and in our nervous system. But maybe you could share a little bit about what you mean by that. And I love that phrase of like the unmetabolized trauma that we experience.
Yeah. So, the way I think about it, everybody has trauma. Some people have more and some people have less. And it really is kind of the difference between big T trauma and little t trauma. So, little t trauma are things that, may really affect us. But we tend to, again, our body metabolizes it. Our subconscious doesn't develop, debilitating stories or really limiting beliefs around it. And then there's big T trauma. And, we know we've experienced big T trauma when it's like we have never felt the same ever since. Maybe we never feel the same about ourselves. We never feel the same about the world, about other people. We never feel as safe. And that trauma, when we experience that kind of trauma, the big T trauma, there's actually a part of our brain that goes offline, and thank goodness it does, because that saves our life in the moment. But if that part of the brain doesn't come back online, it really can prohibit the body from metabolizing our trauma, because as our body is the one that's really meant to kind of experience our feelings and emotions and process through them. It's almost like there's an expansion and a contraction, and an expansion and a contraction. But a lot of times when that part of our brain and body goes offline, when we experience trauma, we kind of expand and there isn't that contraction. And so people end up kind of holding on to, some of the memories, some of the beliefs, some of the sensations of trauma. And even though they get into a situation where, they're no longer being traumatized, they're safe, their body and their brain doesn't know it. And that's where the trauma work, it really helps us kind of whatever we're sitting with that happened long ago. It just helps both our body and brain really process through that, so we can let go of the junk. And if I can use an analogy for trauma, our gut and our brain work in a very similar way. In fact, they're made from the exact same biological material in utero. And it makes sense if you see a picture of a human brain and you see a picture of our GI tract, it looks very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I eat a food, every time I eat a food, my gut immediately goes into processing that food. And the role of my gut is to kind of hold on to the good stuff, the vitamins, the calories, the minerals, the nutrients that will help me grow and develop. And it wants to let go of the junky stuff. And literally, I exit that out of my body. I just poop it right out. And our brain wants to do the same thing. Whenever we have an experience, it wants to hold on to any good stuff that's going to help us learn, grow, develop as a human being, kind of reach our best potential. And it wants to let go of any of the junk that, again, is going to make us feel anxious, depressed, irritable, agitated, traumatized. But again, sometimes when we're traumatized, if our brain and body doesn't come back online, those things, the body and the brain ends up holding on to all of it. And so we get both kind of physiological symptoms and psychological symptoms. And that can really weigh people down. I think and I think some of the most insidious consequences of trauma is it really impacts the way we feel about ourselves. We can feel defective, unlovable, broken. It really affects our sense of safety. We might not feel safe in the world. We might not feel safe with other people. And it also really impacts how in control we feel. And so, really, once we metabolize those things, our nervous system calms down and regulates. Also, disease states get a lot better. There's a lot of literature and research that really shows us that trauma causes inflammation, and inflammation is the root of all disease. So I really think we can trace, not all of them, but a lot of brain and body diseases back to chronic inflammation, that trauma can often be at the core of that, as can kind of chronic stress. And so just being able to alleviate that and move that energy through the body, and also make some of those changes in the subconscious, because trauma affects us at our subconscious brain. And that's why you can't think yourself out of trauma. You can't talk yourself out of trauma. You literally have to feel yourself and kind of shift yourself out of trauma.
Yeah,
and that's what any good trauma work does.
Amazing. I love the analogy you said about you have this expansion without this contraction. So you have this you kick into sympathetic, or dorsal vagal, but you don't get this recalibration back into rest and digest, right? So you get, I love that you said you're weighed down, it literally weighs you down psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically, inflammatory wise. That's such a beautiful, potent metaphor. Thanks for sharing that. And I also wanted to say, like you said, that, big T and little t trauma. I'd love to have you share with so what determines whether it's big T or little t for me versus you versus the person next to us? Because I think there can be so much shame around trauma, that, PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress injury, or any of these things can also have shame, oh, I should be tougher. I should have been able to handle that. Or why did I get it and the person in the car with me, let's say it was a car accident, didn't get it? So just if you can speak to that.
Yeah, there are so many different factors that come into play, but I will tell you, none of those factors have anything to do with a defect in character or a weakness. We do know, however, that people who have developmental trauma, usually childhood trauma, trauma that is often, kind of perpetrated by a caretaker or that we experience during our very, very formative years. The most formative years, of course, being from about age 0 to 7, when we are fully unconscious. Kind of the executive functioning part of our brain is not online. We're just like sponges. And not to say that it stops at 7. Our brain is still kind of going through different brain development and different brain wave patterns up until, about 14 and beyond. But we do know that really having, a lot of adverse childhood experiences really dysregulates our nervous system. Again, highly affects both our body and our subconscious brain. And so for people who, experience some of those early childhood experiences, we know that can, how do I want to say this? Just be ultra impactful. So let's say that you and I are in a car together and we have a car accident, and I have, a long history of developmental trauma. There's a likelihood that I may be more traumatized by that car accident than you would if you don't have that childhood trauma. I think there's also things like, personality, temperament, also resources, right? Some folks are kind of taught more resources. They have more resources at their disposal to deal with difficult things. We know if people are more isolated, they may hold on to more trauma than if they have really healthy connections. In fact, I can't remember if it was either Dick Schwartz or Peter Levine. They're just both kind of gods in the trauma world. It might have even been Bessel van der Kolk. But I heard them say something that really affected me. It said, trauma is not what happens to you. It's how you perceive what happens to you. And it also has to do with how many resources or support you have in the aftermath, right? And so I think there's just a multitude of things. And that's why we see, that people respond very differently to trauma. And that makes sense. We're such different beings. But again, trauma is universal. We all have some kind of trauma. I think it just depends on what support do we have in the aftermath, what resources do we have, and how much trauma did we have previously.
Oh, I love that. And I just so appreciate you setting, light and love, and compassion on it. I think it's just normalizing trauma as a universal experience is so important, because we have enough shame and guilt in other areas of our life. Like if we can lessen that around, I think we're more likely to do our trauma work. I think we're more likely, like you said, to be in our greatness and I completely agree with you, what you said earlier, that our traumas are really one of the things that keep us from our greatness, our greatest self, because they're lodged in our, unconscious. They show up in different ways in so many areas of our life, in relationships and sexuality and in work and all of our relationships. So I just really appreciate the work that you're doing out there in trauma and healing of trauma. I think, I also wanted to, I thought earlier when you were saying, I thought, you mentioned like to be able to do the trauma work. And what would you say? I think there's a hesitancy that I've seen in my clients and in my work in the last 14 years in mental health, that it can be like, oh, one more thing to do, trauma work. It's so heavy. I don't want to rehash the trauma. It was bad enough the first time when I went through it. I don't want to relive it. So what would you say about that and true gifted, skilled trauma work?
Yeah. So trauma work is not necessarily easy, but it is life-shifting and life-changing. You want to make sure that you find a provider who's going to do the right kind of trauma work. There are just a few kind of therapies that science really backs up as helpful for trauma. Traditional talk therapy actually can be much more traumatizing, because what happens is, as people start to talk about their trauma, it really affects their nervous system, and they often kind of fly out of their window of tolerance. The window of tolerance is really like, it's the golden zone, right? So it's where we're feeling our feelings and experiencing our environment, and we're connecting, and we're not kind of over responding or under responding to whatever stimulus is being supplied to us. And then there's something above the window of tolerance, which is hypervigilance, right? It's kind of an overactive, very much, our nervous system is regulated up. Mm-hmm. And then there is something underneath that window of tolerance called underarousal or hypoarousal, where our nervous system is really shut down. And as people start to talk about their trauma, they fly out of the window of tolerance and either become somewhat dissociated, kind of below that window, or they can become really activated and agitated. And then, so people show up, they talk about their trauma, they get over or underactivated. And then they leave, session feeling worse than they came in, especially if they're not resourced, if they don't know ways to kind of label that they're outside of their window and be able to move back in. And so the kinds of therapies that science really shows helps with trauma are things, a therapy called IFS, a therapy called EMDR, somatic practices, right, which is really focusing on the body and letting the body, again, metabolize some of those past things that have gotten really stuck and lodged, and hypnotherapy. So I think if you are going to do trauma work, really do your research and make sure that you go with an empirically validated kind of therapy, and also that you find a practitioner that you feel really safe with, because that is so much of healing from trauma. People don't heal from trauma in isolation. They heal from trauma with safe connection. And, and sometimes I see my clients, their safe connection, they've been hurt by people, but their safe connection is their dog that nuzzles them every night, or their safe connection is their therapist. So I think you want to find the right kind of therapy, again, that science backs up, helps with trauma. And then you want to find somebody that you feel safe with, that you feel really can witness what you've gone through and hold space for that, and not get triggered themselves, right? You want a clinician that can stay in their window of tolerance when you work with them around their trauma. And I think it's that safety and that sacred holding space. There's so much good work that can be done.
I love that. And obviously here we're talking all about trauma and just mental wellness in general, but how do you experience with your clients and your background and your passion, your expertise in this area, that trauma shows up in sexuality and in pleasure and in sensuality?
Yes. Oh, it shows up all the time. Obviously if somebody has sexual trauma, if they've been raped, molested, abused, especially by somebody, that they felt was safe, that, directly can kind of lead to, either things like painful intercourse or not being able to orgasm during sex, not being able to be vulnerable or sometimes even get undressed, get naked in front of someone else. A lot of times that can really kind of contribute to people either completely shutting down or getting extremely anxious in those situations. But even other trauma, right? When somebody who's supposed to be tuned in, available, responsive, engaged, nurturing, when we don't get that, and it can kind of create a trauma, it can be really hard just to connect with other people. And if you remember me saying, I think trauma affects us at least one of three ways. It makes us feel like we're defective, something's wrong with us, we're not enough, we're unlovable. It makes us feel like people or the world isn't safe. And it also makes us feel like we don't have power and control. I mean, those things absolutely play out, in the bedroom when we're with a partner. If we feel like we don't have control over our body or what is done to our body, if we don't feel safe with the other person, or if we feel like something's wrong with us, it can really impact our ability just to kind of basically connect with someone else, not just physically, but also mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and really feel safe in those situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So well said. All three of those areas would be massive as far as sexuality, physical intimacy, sexual intimacy, but also sensuality and feeling, like you mentioned, feeling safe and feeling resourced and connected to my body. You mentioned earlier about like kind of this disc, that we will get this kind of will be detached or will disconnect so that's going to play in as well. But I mean, wow, that's really powerful to think of. All three of those areas would be massively would show up in our own sexual experience. And I really also appreciate you saying it doesn't have to be sexual or physical trauma even to show up in the bedroom, to show up in sexuality. It's because so I'll work with clients and they'll say, well, I haven't been sexually, I don't have sexual trauma. And then we'll see that there was other types of trauma, big T or little t, that really show up in keeping them from dropping fully, deeply in a surrendered way, if that's what they're desiring, into pleasure, into orgasm, into ecstasy.
Yes. And so many times, people feel so uncomfortable in their body. It feels very uncomfortable to be outside of your window of tolerance. And, so even if it I mean, of course, we can have difficulty connecting with somebody when other people have hurt us, but we can also just feel really uncomfortable being in our body. And like you said, experiencing that pleasure, experiencing body sensations. And there are so many kind of triggers for trauma as well. Any of our senses can trigger our trauma.
Mm-hmm.
We can smell something and, oh my God, it's
Right.
like, XYZ's
Yes.
house that, where
Yep.
my needs weren't met, or we
Right.
can see something, we can hear something, we can
Mm-hmm.
touch something, we can taste something. And,
Mm.
so many times, I think the best sex, the most connected and kind of next level sex that people ever had, they're really tuned into their senses. And when you are a very traumatized individual, your senses can be a scary thing.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate you saying that. It's so true because my work and working with couples and individuals, we do a lot of sense practice, and a lot of felt sense practice, right? A lot of sensate focus from Masters of Johnson's from the 60s. Those are really powerful tools, but you're absolutely right that for someone with trauma history, or well, all of us, but it might show up, very much might show up in one or more sensory systems, and that I really appreciate you saying that reflection for me personally, but also that it's the beautiful thing. I mean, right? So our brain is literally wrapped in our sensory organs, so we have these quick ways to help down regulate and to self regulate our brain. However, there might be one of our sensory systems that feels traumatic, feels triggering for us, and so that's knowing that and having that awareness and doing some work around that can really allow us to use our senses to drop more deeply into pleasure.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah,
I totally agree with what you're saying, like being in our senses and falling back into ourselves. But if falling back into ourselves doesn't feel safe, well, then we're not going to fall back into ourselves, right?
Yeah, I mean, the senses can be triggering. They can also be the very thing that heals once we tune into those. We just have to tune into the right senses, right? And again, whatever's going to either kick us back up into our window of tolerance if we've dropped down into that under arousal, or if we're over aroused, we know what senses will drop us back. So the very thing that can be triggering is the very thing that can help us.
Always, right?
Yeah.
And I also think I'd love to hear what you think. Like for me personally, my own personal journey, and I agree with you, Kaleo. I have been in therapy a long time. As a therapist, I will always be in therapy. I love my therapist. He's amazing. But we're constantly doing grounding, somatic, body-based work because I'll find I'm up in my head talking myself through it, and I can't talk my way, like you mentioned, through my traumas. I have to feel and experience my way through my trauma. But I also appreciate what you said, that also means I don't have to re-traumatize myself, right? I don't have to go through the gory details of X, Y, or Z that was really traumatic for me. So I really appreciate you sharing that because I think there can be this why would I want to rehash that again?
Yeah. And the good news is, with IFS or EMDR, there is a component of, yes, you do have to address your traumas. You don't have to, address every little detail. But then right in session, you're able to process through that trauma and keep your nervous system regulated. And then there's somatic therapy, like you're mentioning, where you don't even have to talk about your trauma at all. It's more kind of about creating an internal or external container for your trauma, and making that container bigger so your trauma doesn't overflow your container. Oftentimes it's about getting resourced and just trusting your body. If you give your body space, your body is very smart. Your body is smarter than you, and your body knows kind of how to take on, emotions, sensations, feel them, metabolize them, and then again, that's kind of where we have that, kind of that expansion and then that contraction. Our body is very, very wise. And I've done a lot of talk therapy, trauma therapy in my past. I've more recently found a somatic practitioner, and it has just blown my mind. I didn't know when what you said resonated with me so much. I have a tendency to kind of try to think my way through problems. And it was such a gift to realize oh my God, my body can do this for me. My brain doesn't have to work overtime, trying to figure out all the things. My body
Yeah.
can metabolize this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
I think
So
that's a part of
beautiful.
sensuality too, is realizing that your
Mm-hmm.
body is your friend. And if you
Mm-hmm.
tune into your body, our body sends us signals, right? So, if you've got, a cough, or you have itchy skin, or you've got a pain, that's your body sending you signals. And so often I think we disconnect from our body and ignore. Our body also has the ability, again, to process all of these complex emotions and things that we're experiencing, our feelings. But I think we forget that our body is really our ally. And it's very hard for us, I think, kind of sexually or with our sexuality to also drop into our body if we don't see it as like our biggest ally and friend.
Absolutely. That was so well said. It's so well said. And like, we're not going to want to go into our body if our body doesn't feel safe. So like you said, these practices to create that space, that spaciousness, but also that like deep grounding. And that has been my experience in working through my own trauma, just like you shared, is that I couldn't talk my way through it. I really tried. I really tried. And I could get so far. I could get to a point, but learning not only to feel my way through it, but also to feel like you might notice that like I'm doing this like little swaying as we talk, because for me that feels pleasurable. That feels I'm able to be more here with you, more present, to feel into it because it feels good. Like, and I've been told you move too much in your podcast. And I'm like, yeah, well, it's for a reason. Like it feels right. And somewhere we were taught to like sit still and be rigid, yet our bodies, like you said, are so wise. They don't want to stay still. Right. That's literally like a freeze response, or could be a freeze response. And so learning to, for me, movement has been really thoughtful. Loving movement has been a big part of my own healing journey and my own healing of trauma. Is how does my body want to move, and giving her permission to do that. It might be dance, it might be yoga, it might be going for a walk, it might be very young, it might be like climbing a mountain, whatever, but really listening and that practicing. I mean, I would say that's a practice to learn to listen to our body, and not one we're taught. Like forget trauma, that for sure impacts it, but also culturally. So, society, media does not promote, let's listen to our body.
Correct. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. So you mentioned about different forms of treatment and therapy that can work, and people can look those up. I'll make sure I put those in the show notes, but we always do it as sexy homework on this podcast. And so what would you say as, 1, 2, or 3 other tips that you can give for our listeners and our watchers to begin to metabolize their trauma, begin to not only metabolize it, but grow from it and benefit from it?
Yeah. So I think moving your body, like you said, is huge. Oftentimes if we've had shock trauma, right? Maybe there was a fire and we were traumatized because we couldn't get out of the house. Maybe we need to pick up running, right? Especially if we tune into our body and our feet have the sensation of movement. It's like, oh my God, go move your body. Maybe if we weren't able to set a lot of boundaries with caretakers and that was traumatizing to us, sometimes even like holding your hand up like a stop, right? As we're telling people like, no, I won't be able to make it to dinner, or no, I can't do that. Letting our body, because oftentimes what causes trauma is our body, whatever movement we needed to complete, being stifled. So being able to kind of recreate that and moving our body, whether it's through some of the mechanisms that I talked about or some kind of regular exercise routine, things like yoga, stretching, tai chi, lifting heavy weights, just moving our body, I think can be really helpful.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Also just think connection, right? Is finding some safe people that you can connect to, because therapy, back in our ancestors' time, was our caveman ancestors at the end of a day sitting around the campfire, kind of talking about what happened and giving and getting support. And so that would be my other kind of tip, is just to connect with people, whether that's connect emotionally, spiritually, physically. And then, especially if you're a trauma survivor, you want to be pretty particular about who you let in to really connect with. And when you find those safe people, I think really leaning into those folks can be so important. And then just some of the basics. I'm a firm believer that, food is medicine or food is poison. Every time you put something in your mouth, you're either moving yourself towards healing and health or moving yourself closer towards, disease and death. And so really being mindful of kind of taking care of yourself in that way, both with nutrition and with hydration. I'm going to give more than 3. Sleep is a pinnacle.
I love it.
Not only can you not heal from your trauma if you're not sleeping well, but you just can't think and function clearly.
Right.
if you're not
Absolutely.
sleeping kind of that 7 to 9 hours every single night. And
Absolutely. And there's
also,
research on that so solid about like that helps us to like take things that have been, probably more like little t traumatic to us, but also like to integrate them. Like our sleep actually does that for us. So if we're not getting good
absolutely.
sleep, we're not doing that as much.
Absolutely. Yeah, life is kind of like a funnel, right? Every day that we're awake, we're getting stimulus input into the funnel, but our brain can only process so much at
Mm-hmm.
once. When we're sleeping, we're not receiving stimulus input because we're not aware, and that's when our
Mm-hmm.
funnel draineth out, right? So
Mm-hmm.
absolutely there's, processing of short-term memory, processing of traumas while we're sleeping. And so sleep is very important. And then the other thing I always like to mention, because I think a lot of trauma work is really focused on, well, how do we get people from feeling crappy to feeling okay? And with my clients, I'm always talking about how are you chasing bliss and joy, right? So every day, I think that,
Yes.
searching and chasing and leaning into that
Mm.
bliss, whether,
Yeah.
you do have a safe partner and having sex is bliss, or
Mm-hmm.
connecting with them in some sensual
Mm-hmm.
way, or your dog is bliss, or you love to go
Mm-hmm.
bowling and that's your bliss, you've got a hobby that you love. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think so, kind of to go back to your point of a lot of people, oh, trauma, oh, that sounds so terrible, I don't want to have to go through that. Yeah, you got to get through the muck, but you also have to do the stuff that makes you feel like life is worth living,
Mm.
and getting some of that bliss. And so I'm always working with my clients on chasing that as we do the trauma work.
Amazing. I love that. And bliss and joy. I totally agree. Pain can be a powerful teacher. We all know that. But so can bliss and joy and pleasure and orgasm and all the things.
Yes,
So
yes.
that's so great. I love that. Awesome. Well, Kaleo, we always do a speed round of questions for our guests. So are you ready for our little speed round?
Let's do it.
So, sex, science, and sacredness, these are the three pillars of our podcast. And so, I'm going to ask you, Kaleo, right now in this moment for you in your life, what makes you feel sexiest?
Hmm. What makes me feel sexiest? I do love to put on little outfits. That I think can really help me connect with like my own body and feeling my best. And I think also what helps me really feel sexy is when I work on that emotional connection with my partner. Um, because I think not just for women, but I think women in particular, sex can be about so much more than the physical act itself. But I always like to feel cute and feel sexy in my little outfits. Yeah, and then just that emotional connection.
Amazing. Love it. Totally celebrate that. As Pharrell says, that foreplay starts the day before for many women.
That's
I totally
right.
agree.
That's right. It starts when the husband is helping with the kids and cleaning the
Exactly.
kitchen and doing the
Exactly.
laundry. Yes.
Hmm.
Which my husband is very good at those things, I will tell
Ah,
you.
good. Awesome. And then science, our second pillar. So you clearly have a science mind and a very bright mind. So what right now in science or research or in your own practice is really like lighting you up, getting excited to kind of follow and study and research about?
Yeah, so I've really been into neuroplasticity recently, and that just really is our brain's ability to like build new neural pathways, and to change and to heal. And, for so long, neuroplasticity wasn't a thing that was known about. People thought, oh, you're this way, your genetics, fix your life and predetermine things for you. And so I'm really lit up by neuroplasticity and also epigenetics, right? And epigenetics as a science really says that yes, we come with DNA, we come with predispositions, but our cells are affected by the environment. And so, what that tells me is we need to be very cautious about our environment. We need to be cautious about what we consume, about what we expose ourselves to, because our environment very much affects like our genetics and our DNA. And I think that those things kind of go hand in hand. But yeah, I've been totally on fire about those things.
I totally agree. I've nerd out on both of those. Amazing. So cool. And like you said, it's like neuroplasticity. It's kind of catching up to what we've always felt as clinicians that we have this ability to change our brain. And now we know that that's true. And
Yeah.
that's so exciting. It's so
Yes. And you
exciting.
can
So,
see it in people,
hmm
right?
hmm yeah. Awesome. And then our third pillar is sacredness. So, right now for you in your life, what feels sacred?
Oh my gosh. I would say since the pandemic, my home has felt very sacred to me.
Yeah.
There was a period of time, it was very chaotic, this time last year. I never thought that my husband would be working from home, I'd be working from home, and then my little 6, 7 year old daughter would be homeschooling in the same home. So it was chaotic, but my home has felt so sacred and so safe. And I've never, I have a beautiful home, but I've never appreciated my home like I have through the pandemic. It has just been like a rock and a pillar, a place where not only have I felt physically safe, but emotionally safe. There's so much yummy things that happen inside a home, right? I mean, it is where I connect emotionally with my partner and sexually, where I parent my daughter and get all my snuggles. It's where my two amazing dogs that bring me so much love live. It's where I have
Love that.
beautiful aesthetic things to look at.
Right.
And again, it's just that vibe of safety. So I would say this is really my sacred space. I also have a place in my home that is ultra sacred to me. I've got a sauna there. It's where I do my meditation. It's where I do my yoga. And it feels safe. It feels like home and brings me a lot of comfort.
So your sanctuary sure sounds beautiful. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Of
I
course.
always feel so intimate to get to hear that from my guests. So thank you. And I just wanted to thank you again for joining us and for sharing time today. And how can our listeners and our watchers find you, Kaleo, and learn more about your work?
Yeah, so I work with folks from kind of all different walks of life. My biggest specialty is working with really high level professionals. A lot of my clients are therapists or doctors or CEOs, kind of executive leadership. And the kind of work that I do, I mean, of course, I do supportive therapy, but I also do what I call kind of transformational therapy, which is really this trauma work, having these deep shifts, metabolizing stuff that's been really stuck, that's really keeping people from kind of reaching their optimal potential. And so I do have an Instagram, and my Instagram handle is at Kaleo, my first name, .awana. That's spelled KALEO.AWANA. I also have a website, growthestablishment.com, where you can find out a little bit more about me, my practice, and how to contact me.
Awesome. I'll make sure we have those in the show notes. And thank you, Kaleo, for sharing time today.
Oh, it's just been my pleasure.
It's been such a joy and so nice to reconnect with you. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in or watching today. And thank you for being brave and opening your hearts to love deep.